Thank you for coming by for the not quite noontime lecture, but close enough. I'm Professor Jeff Caton from over at the Center for Strategic Leadership, and I'm the Associate Professor of Cyberspace Operations over there. And today, the topic is, of course, emerging challenges, cyberspace and cyberstrategy. And I hope to address the key question of how does or how should the United States incorporate cyberspace into national security policy and strategy. Let you read. There's three key objectives I'd like for the presentation here, and these are derived from your lesson objectives for today's lecture. So we'll talk a little bit about transnational phenomena as examples, and also some of the overarching objectives for the course of NSPS. I will take a little bit of time at some points to read from the slide, just because I know there's some fine print and some that may not come across for those of you who are watching from the seminar rooms. So please allow me that little bit of indulgence there. And the slides are posted on the 90-day temporary drive in the P drive if you're interested in getting those. And in case always the disclaimer here, the views that I express during the next 40 minutes or so are not necessarily those of the United States Army War College, or the Center for Strategic Leadership. They're mine and mine alone, so you can blame them on me. This is the overview. And what I'd like to do is have a kind of a survey level of approach to the lecture here. In other words, I'm going to try to introduce you to several key concepts of strategy that have come out just this year. And because there's actually been quite a bit that's out there, I'll only be able to hit kind of the wave tops on that, not an in-depth analysis. So I want to introduce those and then give some illustrative instruction or examples, several of which come out of this, the most recent Joint Forces Quarterly magazine, if you've had a chance to read those on there. So again, first, just really quickly touch on what is cyberspace, what strategies is the U.S. developing to define its roles and activities in cyberspace, the recent national and transnational phenomenon that has shaped the development of these strategies and continue to kind of work back and forth in their continued evolution, and then some thoughts on how the U.S. should proceed. And again, that's not going to be recommendations as much as it is what are some of the questions that should be asked on that. Cyberspace, you've had a chance to do some readings, and I know one of the readings you had for today's lesson was the new DoD strategy for operating in cyberspace. The basic definition from DoD, which goes back to when DepSecDef Gordon England had it in 2008, is up here. Global domain with information within the information environment consisting of the interdependent network of information technology infrastructures, including the internet, telecommunications networks, computer systems, and embedded processors and controllers. And then I add three keywords on there, and their operators. Why do I want to add that? Because if you look back in 313, the Joint Pub 313, what will probably be in Joint Pub 312, which is in work now for cyberspace operations, you always see the cognitive, the content, and the connectivity, or the cognitive portion of cyberspace, the informational, and the physical. Another way of looking at it was put forth by Admiral Sabrowski, who, if you remember back in 2004, was Secretary Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld's point man for transformation. And he came out and said, maybe we can look at cyberspace as a new strategic common, analogous to the sea, as an international domain of trade and communication. And of course, only in definitions like that can you have common and domain in the same word. But anyway, kind of looking at the two aspects of cyberspace. Which is correct? Well, the answer is it depends on the application that you're doing in there. And if you get to the strategy, the DoD strategy on cyberspace, and again, it sets off saying that, hey, if we're looking at organizing, training, and equipping forces, it's probably good to look at it in the domain point. If we're looking at it from a national security strategy aspect, the commons approach probably is better. What I've got here, and this diagram will be in your information operations primer, which if you haven't gotten it, you'll be getting that soon. This diagram is in there. You can study it in more depth. But what I did is went into the Joint Operating Environment document, which used to be published by Joint Forces Command, and the capstone concept for joint operations, which is a document you'll learn more about in your DEM course, your Defense Enterprise Management, and just looked at some of the ways they've characterized connections of cyberspace and activities, and they go from almost to the point of every cyber warrior or rifleman equivalent to where it says every network operator is on the front line, everyone who logs in is a cyber defender first at the very tactical level, all the way up to we're saying, hey, we want to ensure we have the ability to maneuver freely in cyberspace, and this is going to amplify all instruments of national power. And that so it goes from very low to very high, depending on the application you're going to do in that. The key item to look at is what is that proper environment going to be, and it's not something that's trivial, and it's not something that's static. In fact, it is changing and changing very rapidly. So what does it look like? Well, there's all kinds of different technical ways of mapping cyberspace, and this, just approaching that aspect alone could be several lectures in there. Here's a couple of visualizations looking at from the old cable and wireless diagrams to Internet Protocol versions 1, versions 4 and version 6, and some of the nodal mapping to some other very high-tech ones on there. But I thought they were a little bit too much detail for the purposes here. So I'd like to use a more simplified analogy, and I've looked to a classic American artist, C.M. Coolidge, which I had asked before if anyone knew of his works. And is anyone familiar with C.M. Coolidge? Well, I selected his photo, or his painting of A Friend in Need, because again, it from the Dogs Playing Poker series on there. And it's okay, first a little attention getter, sure, but it's also interesting that, okay, you've got dogs playing poker. There's a little bit of absurdity in that, but it's also like we have a lot of people that are active in cyberspace right now. Do they all really know what they're doing in there? Do they really know what the other players are? Are there rules established? Always look and see, of course, the punchline in this is the little bulldog passing an ace to his other bulldog buddy there. But if there's no rules in the game, is he really cheating? Anyway, well, maybe something's a little bit more actionable. We'll get back to the poker playing in a minute. Is maybe looking at what are the different threats and opportunities that are available in cyberspace. This is a good diagram in that it shows the complexity once you start looking at some of the things that were discussed today, actually in Ambassador Johnson's lecture. He talked about organized crime, narcotics trafficking. Those have very heavy links into cyberspace. And so when you start looking at how, in fact, you can even draw links between the two of those in there through cyberspace, and when you're talking about some of the intricacies and the challenges of tracking down money launderers, well, that's only gotten harder by the ubiquitousness of communication aspects through cyberspace. We have areas you can see here: counterintelligence, cybercrime, insider threat, attacks on critical infrastructure. Again, very, very close to home with the Department of Homeland Security. And then the challenges, and then there's different attack vectors. You can go, the ones you may be familiar with, people trying to hack into your computer, but it can also be at the supply chain. It can be, insiders, people that have been co-opted to go in and actually provide information that way. This diagram here shows it as a kind of a DoD-centric view, and as you go out, you go from DoD to federal to state and local to private industry, public, foreign. I would submit you could take this diagram and you could put any of those units that are organizations or entities that are represented by these outer rings and put them in the middle, and it would look pretty much the same. So the purpose is not to argue over whether this is an accurate portrayal or not. The purpose of this is to show all these kind of bouncing marbles that are going around, and showing that when you start looking at issues and you start pulling that thread in cyberspace, even though you can start it, it looks like it's a DoD problem, it can very easily get out to the public, to foreign governments, et cetera, in there. So it's a complex issue right off the bat. But what are some of the existing legal obligations and legal roles that have been assigned so far to start working this out? Well, just looking from the defense part of it, you can already see, you may have seen this chart before, we have a lot of different titles in our U.S. codes where we have organizations that are given responsibilities. Homeland Security, Title VI, Title 10, we're most familiar with the military side, and that's the side under which U.S. Cyber Command has been stood up. Title 18, working with crime investigation, Department of Justice. Title 44, Title 50, looking at Title 50, looking at the intel side. That's the other hat that General Alexander wears as the head of NSA. That's complementary to his Title 10 side with U.S. Cyber Command. The key part here is we're looking at the executive to provide the direction, and then all of these organizations working together to hopefully provide that end product of cyber security. The problem is, how do we start getting an actionable framework to make this happen? And, well, gee, this is your NSPS to not to be too patronizing, but this is a good start for looking at a framework of working down through this. The strategy formulation model. And again, as you know, you've worked through this, you have internal areas in there and you have external areas. First overarching in the current national security strategy, neither government nor private sector nor individual citizens can meet this challenge of cybersecurity alone. We also need to strengthen our international partnerships on a range of issues. And from the internal side, this is just some examples of areas where there has been progress made since President Obama has come in and put that in after his 2009 cyberspace policy review. There is now a White House cybersecurity coordinator, Howard Schmidt, who has been working in there. Although one might argue he's been given a lot of responsibility and a lot of titles where he sits on both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council, but he doesn't have perhaps the authority and the resources to make some of these happen, and really doesn't have any direct control over any of the agencies that need to do that. At the request of Senator Harry Reid, the White House came up with some proposals for legislation to help consolidate some of the issues relating to cybersecurity, cyberspace, and they were forwarded in May 2011. But again, they're competing with a lot of other legislative issues in there. The NSERP, the National Critical Infrastructure, our National Cyberspace Incident Response Plan, was developed by the Department of Homeland Security last September and tested in an exercise called Cyberstorm, and it was their third Cyberstorm exercise, and they brought in a collection of departments, including DoD, agencies, industry, state partners, and international partners to work out some of these areas in there. So there's been some progress made internally on that. On the external front, the international, the NATO cyber defense policy has just come out in June of 2011, and it's kind of a structure now. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. Probably one of the oldest documented one, and old, we're talking cyberspace, you're not talking that far back, is the Cybercrime Convention in 1997. I think it's up to 32 signatories, but it discreetly outlaws 4 areas of activity such as copyright infringement, child pornography, things that countries have come together and said, yes, we all agree these are criminal acts in cyberspace. And more importantly, the Department of Justice in the United States and their counterparts in other countries have actually successfully extradited citizens from other countries to stand trial in the U.S. for crimes they've done that they committed in there. And the Department of Justice has information on their public website if you want more in there. There's international organizations out there that do things like work on naming the domain, ICANN, which is out there looking at how are we going to structure and come up with the different names of domains, and when you're looking at how does somebody get a website and how is all that governed, this is a cooperative, non-governmental, although it's supported by governments, organization that is helping that structure in there, and I'll talk a little bit more about governance bodies as well. And then there's also work that the Department of Justice does through Interpol and other ones to, they're starting to get some international norms on how they do that. But again, it's played against a lot of different countries' interest and a lot of different policies and laws that they have in there. So it's a play and work. So I'd like to do right now, getting back to the dogs playing poker, what we've had this year is we've dealt ourselves a hand. There's been several major strategies that have come out and our plans that have been issued, and they kind of form, if you would, our current hand in poker. And I want to step through each of those now. And so we have a dime poker hand, because there's one in each of the diplomatic, information, military, and economic areas. And then we got an ace kicker, and the ace in this case stands for alliance, which is that NATO cyber defense policy that I had mentioned. The question is this hand going to be a royal flush for us, or aces and eights, the infamous dead man's hand? Is it going to be that? Don't know. Well, let me step through now. We'll start off with the D part, the diplomacy. Probably had some of this in today's lesson and some of the other areas in here, looking at what goes into a good international strategy, what are some of the areas that you want to hear. There shouldn't be anything earth-shattering in that, and it keeps with a same kind of structure that I think you've seen maybe even in today's lesson, looking at going off into three major areas: the diplomacy, the defense, and the development. I think the emphasis it has in the document here, and again, I'm not going to give you a intimate review of that, but if you'd like offline to discuss any of these, please get in contact with me, and I'd be glad to do that. There is a good emphasis on the development with other countries in there. And personally, and this is kind of my personal assessment right now, is that's one of the major areas that we're kind of falling short with right now in the cyberspace strategy, is that if you would, cyberspace is, the governance of it, et cetera, is still forming. The environment itself is still being formed out there. And there's a lot of countries that are looking for more powerful nations to help them. And when they look at what are some of the countries they're going to look at if they're talking cyberspace? The U.S., who else? Yeah, Russia, China, you hear on it? So this is, not saying we're getting back to the old Cold War days or anything on that, but right now, if there are countries that are going to start looking at someone to come in and help them with infrastructure and with software and with security on there, it would certainly be in our benefit to be a part of that from day one rather than trying to come into that later on. The defense and diplomacy areas, I'll talk on some other slides. But again, nothing really outside the norm on here. It just goes into areas where economy, protecting networks, law enforcement, military, internet governance, development, internet freedom. Again, these are key aspects, and I think they did a good treatment in this strategy with that. One of the surprising things I want to point out in this strategy was a declaratory statement of deterrence with regard to cyberspace. During the 2009 cyber policy review, one of the speakers that testified before Congress had forwarded the notion of perhaps it's time to come up with the equivalent of a Monroe Doctrine in cyberspace to kind of say, okay, we're still forming things on here, but we kind of consider any acts of aggression or et cetera in cyberspace as potentially an act of aggression against the United States, and we're not going to tolerate that. Kind of starting to form what our sphere of influence is on that. So this actually came out, I thought, was kind of surprisingly candid statements on that. I'm going to read it for the benefit of those who may not be able to see it on their screens there. But it specifically addresses the right of self-defense. And again, now we're talking back to Article 4 in the UN Charter. But consistent with the United States Charter, or United Nations Charter, states we have an inherent right to self-defense that may be triggered by certain aggressive acts in cyberspace. Okay, when warranted, the United States will respond to hostile acts in cyberspace as we would any other threat to our country. And then kind of going back under that umbrella of our friends and allies, we can also say reserve the right to use all necessary means, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, as appropriate and consistent with applicable international law in order to defend our nation, our allies, our partners, and our interest. And in doing so, we will exhaust all options before military force whenever we can. So as any good deterrent statement in there, it's going to have some specifics in saying we're going to reserve the right to have this sphere of influence we consider as our interest and we want to defend, but it also provides sufficient vagueness and ambiguousness to allow not only flexibility, but also to put a potential adversary on alert, whereas if you draw a clear red line, well, they know up to what point they can operate, and that doesn't do any service. Obviously, this is a policy that's going to our statement is going to need some continued definition and evolution in there, and the whole concept of deterrence in cyberspace is one that is still going through a lot of very vigorous debate and study. So something to watch out for in the future. Under internet governance, I would point you to a document I thought is very helpful in there. It's actually a GAO report, and not all GAO reports are bad. This one, GAO 10-606, came out last July. Actually does a very good job of giving about a 1 or 2 paragraph description of each of the major international and multinational organizations that are working with the governance of various aspects of cyberspace. Now, some of these are the actual items like naming the domains, et cetera. Some are establishing, say, common protocols for communication to go back and forth. Some of them are under the charter of the UN. Others are under other organizations. But what's interesting in here is, if you look on this line here, and again, you probably can't even see it here, but you can look it up on the report or on the slides. The State Department has a role in many of these. They're very critical to ensuring these capabilities in there. And again, I know part of the debate today was about, as you're looking at, even if you come up with a good strategy that's going to link the ways, ends, and means, when you have those means, and again, you're talking in that balance of looking at what Department of Defense has versus Department of State, they're struggling enough to do with the development in the diplomacy in the areas they have now. Adding cyberspace to that, are they going to be able to do this in there? Secretary of State Clinton has assigned, does have a cyber point of contact, Mr. Painter, who is working on these areas there. Haven't seen any real products on there, but it seems that they've been probably among the most proactive of the departments now addressing these issues in there. But when you're looking at all the different agencies that are across here, all the different international organizations, a fundamental element of having success in a global environment is establishing and maintaining trust in cyberspace. And this comes into the first foundation of that is not just a trust among what people are going to do, but also a trust in the actual cyberspace information process itself, that it's not going to be disrupted or somehow changed as it's in transit. And under the I card now, there's been a strategy that came out in April of this year, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, often referred to as the NSTIC. And you can see, again, its vision, and I'll read that for if you can't quite see it there. The vision is individuals and organizations utilize secure, efficient, easy-to-use, and interoperable identity solutions to access online services in a manner that promotes confidence, privacy, choice, and innovation. Those have to work sometimes on a balance with each other. When you start looking at, they're kind of taking an identity ecosystem approach. Department of Homeland Security has looked at security from an ecosystem approach. That's a different topic for a different day. But again, in this identity ecosystem, they're trying to design it to securely support transactions that range from anonymous to fully authenticated, from low value to high value in there. And part of the most of the rest of the guiding principles are based on this identity ecosystem. But I'll point out now, because this is a recurring theme in here, and it's a theme that was clearly identified in the 2009 policy review, and has gone through all of the other cyber documents. It's good that it's maintaining a consistent thread. That doesn't mean it's not an easy. It's going to be an easy problem to solve. But it's this whole area of privacy enhancing while being secure at the same time. And there's going to be that two-edged sword, or that tug of war that goes on between trying to make something that protects your privacy but is also secure, and then also is able to have freedom of operation in there and personal freedom in its use. So this freedom and privacy versus security is going to be juxtaposed in a lot of how these strategies are working on there. Well, if you're looking at getting a trusted identity in cyberspace, and again, if you look at some of the end uses for this, a lot of it comes down to being able to do commerce online. And so that kind of comes in. I'm going to get these a little bit out of order, but we're going to play the E card here now for the economic point. And I have to say, arguably, I would say this is right now the weakest card in our hand. It's not a full-blown strategy. In fact, what we had released in June 2011 from the Department of Commerce was an interim report. They called it a green paper on their Internet task force. And if you really go through and read it on there, back the national security strategy had kind of set forth the stakes on there, saying the Internet and e-commerce are keys to economic competitiveness. We will continue to invest in cutting-edge research and development necessary to meet these challenges for ensuring that economical initiatives, but also innovation and excellence on there. Unfortunately, right now, they're there hasn't been a lot of solutions on there. Most of this paper comes out with a lot of questions, not really any milestones or any indication on how that's going to be actionable. And I call it probably one of the weakest cards because we're dealing with this on a daily basis. I mean, how much right now? Think about if you're going home today or this weekend, and you're looking at, or even when you're in New York City, how much of your preparation and your activities are going to be done dealing with commerce on a plastic card or on the internet? I mean, how many times now are you actually going to pull out cash or a checkbook anymore? It's getting less and less on there. So this is fundamental to ensuring we have the items on there. And again, it brings out some of the areas in here where at the same time you're trying to ensure you have privacy and security and a free flow of information. These are all ends that are going to pull against each other. So it needs to be resolved. And again, this needs to be coordinated back with the NSTIC and back with the diplomatic areas as well. How serious are the implications with respect to the economy? And how much of a problem is this in there? There's been a lot of different reports. The DNI came up in their annual report earlier this year, gave some numbers in there that talked about potential losses for businesses due to fraud and theft online. I expect any day we should have the 2011 report to Congress, the U.S. and China economy and security report that comes to Congress every year. But that's just dealing with the U.S. and China. But normally it has a chapter or a good portion of a chapter dedicated to areas where there's been economic issues back and forth. Last year, one of the big things was China, the breakup of and the removal of our Google breaking ties with China because China had broken into their system. There's a new report out, just came out last month, or right just within the last couple of weeks, from the Office of a National Counterintelligence Executive on foreign spies stealing U.S. economic secrets in cyberspace. And again, other countries are definitely interested in U.S. economic secrets. This report did not delve into individual personal identification information such as Social Security numbers, credit card numbers, as much as it looked into what corporations have, which are their secret sauce, if you would, that intellectual property, that information that they've paid, invested a lot of capital funds in research and development to be able to use as their leverage and their edge in the competition in the industry. And if it's just being taken from them, that has some very severe implications. The two big villains in this that they reported on were, again, no surprise, China and Russia in there. China identified as a persistent collector. An interesting reference they had in there about 3 times was something called Project 863, which I had not heard of before, but I guess this was a kind of an economic policy that China initiated in 1986. So instead of looking at this as saying, well, suddenly China is coming in and doing this, it kind of puts it into perspective of saying they established where they were going to, the areas they wanted to go into the technology, and they've only expanded on that. And if you caught Jeff Troxel's economic noontime lecture with China on there, he mentioned, I think they're in their 12th 5-year plan on that, and they continue to expand the areas that they are targeting. But among those are looking at the information and communications technology, the ones actually dealing directly with cyberspace, but also military, especially in the areas of marine, aerospace, aeronautics, and of course that's submarines, that's carrier-based activity, drones, etc. And then also civil and dual-use technologies, clean energy, something of interest to China certainly, advanced materials, healthcare, agriculture. So again, if you start looking at that, especially in the civilian and dual use, that's something that maybe doesn't always come up on our radar screen there, but if you look at those together, clean energy, you're trying to get a better environment over. Advanced materials, that's looking at ways of developing things without the commodities of traditional items. Healthcare, you're dealing with aging populations. Agriculture, you're dealing with feeding populations. So these are essential to a nation's larger strategies on there. Another very interesting item to note in this report was the fact that it brings out the fact that not all of the people that are coming, not all the foreign entities that are coming in and doing some of the industrial sabotage are necessarily we consider adversaries. In fact, some of the ones that we are allied with are also coming in and extracting that information, not necessarily as a national policy, but as industries that are located in those countries. So again, that's something that shouldn't be any surprise, but again, bears note. And some of the things they look towards the future, potential increasing roles of the hackers for hire, hacktivists, the ones that are trying to make a point, such as your WikiLeaks, your anonymous organizations, and then disgruntled insiders, especially when you're dealing with perhaps less than stellar economic environment. But what if all the what if the diplomatic, the information, the economic sides get a little bit worse in there, and we start edging over towards the military side on that? Well, then we're going to have to look at the potential use of a military force or military forces to defend interest in cyberspace. The 2010 National Security Strategy, to quote here, we will deter, prevent, detect, defend against, and quickly recover from cyber intrusion attacks. And again, by investing in people and technologies and strengthening partnerships. So again, we're this theme of getting the technological superiority, again, developing robust partnerships and developing a good working workforce that is cyber savvy also carries through in this. You hopefully have had a chance to read the DoD strategy in there. Again, it hits on the themes, again, treating cyberspace as an operational domain for doing your force structure development, employing new defensive sense systems on there, and concepts in the DoD networks and systems. Again and again, by the current way it's divvied up in the Title 10, this is going to be primarily DoD defending its networks, and then also defending the other areas, such as its agreement with the Department of Homeland Security for looking at its part of the critical infrastructure, which is largely the defense industrial base. Partnering with U.S. other departments and agencies, that kind of comes under the critical infrastructure protection areas, building robust relationships with our allies and partners, and again, leveraging ingenuity and an exceptional cyber workforce, and trying to get rapid technological innovation as part of the strategy in there. This is pretty much what was laid out by Deputy Secretary of Defense Lynn back in October of last year in a Foreign Affairs article. He laid out that, and actually, I think if you're going to read something, you get a better feel for it. Reading that article is probably better than reading the strategy in some cases with that. One of the concerns that's not addressed in the strategy, and again, this is my personal assessment, that I have not seen addressed in the areas on there, and this is just for a note for future thought, is again, trying to look to see if we're lagging or leading the target. There doesn't seem to be in any of the strategies, and especially not in the DoD one, where we're looking at trying to envision what cyberspace is going to be in the future, what its elements may be turning into, and how we would structure a force for the future with that. Now, it's very difficult because we're in the proverbial situation now where we're in the swamp with the alligators, and you're trying to save yourself from the alligators, and you don't have time to drain the swamp. I guess one of the recommendations I've made is maybe we need to come up with a bifurcated strategy where we have one that deals with the here and now, which is pretty much what this does, and then maybe a separate, distinctly separately resourced, separately overseeing one that's looking just at the future of cyberspace on there. All right, I'll put that soapbox away, and we'll look at saying this is the U.S. side. I had mentioned before our ace kicker, which is how we're doing with alliances on there. And NATO, of course, is probably one of the ones that first comes to mind. And if you remember last November, they had the summit at Lisbon, and they came up with a new strategic concept for NATO. And it, among other things, reinvigorated or re-emphasized that NATO is a nuclear deterrence alliance, among other items on there, but also looked at some of the other transnational threats, which included weapons of mass destruction and cyber threats in there. So this was a follow-on to that Lisbon summit, and in June, the NATO defense ministers met and approved the policy on there, and they're now just starting to get some of the wheels on that. Three of the overarching tenets that come in there match well with the U.S.'s items on there. One is prevention, next is resilience, that ability to rapidly recover, or as we sometimes say, fight through cyber attacks in there. And then their third is non-duplication. And again, what they're looking at is saying, well, if we're doing defense in depth and we're doing items in here, we can share in our capacity, share our information, get a collective situational awareness, and then perhaps not everybody addressing all the same threats, but trying to make sure that if we do have duplicated efforts, it's for a good reason, and that it's not wasteful. This kind of works through that poker hand, if it would, that has been dealt there. These are strategies that are out working on that. One of the questions which pops up, and it gets back to perhaps that declaratory statement in the international strategy, is when you start crossing the line from where this becomes competitive to maybe aggressively competitive to aggressive to actually getting into use of force and warfare. And again, there's no clean answer on that. That's still being worked through and still being defined. There is some debate on, the kinetic and non-kinetic natures of some of the activities in cyberspace. I'd like to show you, just to touch on, and it's a framework that helps to maybe not show you where that line is discretely, but conceptually where that might fall in some of the areas that are in there. And by the way, this diagram will also be in your information operations primer when you get a copy of that. But there's a gentleman, Michael Schmidt, who is now just came on the faculty at the Naval War College, I think is a visiting professor there. But he's done quite a bit of work in this area, looking at how do we start taking a cyber incident, for lack of a better term, if something happens, an event happens in cyberspace, and you want to know, is this really influencing our interests? Is it something that we need to take measures against? If so, what type of measures in there? What instrument of national power do we institute? And what are other people thinking about on there? Well, always overarching that area in here is the Article 51 rights, self-defense, et cetera, dealing with every country in there. And there's always going to be this kind of not discrete line, but kind of a measured line where you're looking at considering, do we have a justification to go to war? And if we've crossed the area where we're actually slinging bullets or other ordnance back and forth, now that we're in a shooting war, how do we conduct that in coordination with our established things such as the law of armed conflict? So you might say we could, and he has a very good article. I can again, it's referenced in the IO primer if you want to read it. If you're really interested in this area, he goes through and steps through a lot of the UN charters, the NATO articles, and kind of brings some historical efforts in there. Part of the culmination of his current research has come up with what's been termed the Schmidt assessment criteria. And these are 7 measures which he kind of goes through and says, if we look at these areas in 2 given events, let's take a traditional kinetic attack event and maybe one that's dealing just with cyberspace, and look at severity, immediacy, directness, invasiveness, measurability, presumptive legitimacy, and responsibility, and kind of grade those. Maybe we can start getting a better handle on where that falls in this area here. Now, this criteria is designed pretty much for state on state at this point. So the question is going to come up: what if it is a non-state actor, or what if it's a non-state actor that is maybe sponsored by a state on there? And these are areas in there that can go on. And then there's even other areas such as, can we ever cross the line in cyberspace where we have sufficient indications and warning where we may have preemptive self-defense? Okay, those are unresolved, definitely worth looking into, and still being rigorously investigated and debated internationally at this point. But Michael Schmidt is one in there. The pragmatic point, and this is something I think is another caution, the pragmatic point is that if a country's leaders feel that they've been attacked in cyberspace and it affects some of their vital interests, and they decide to retaliate with kinetic warfare, all this doesn't really matter. This is all academic. So those are some of the things that need to be avoided as well. What are some of the players that are out there in cyberspace? These are the big ones right now, and I'll read. I know you can't read the ones here back in the area, so I just want to read off the top 10 in order of the number of internet users they have. China and the United States, by the way, just the 2 of them are almost a third of the internet users right now in the world. This is as of June of 2010. I'm sorry, June of 2011, I believe, on this. But China, the United States, Japan, India, Brazil, Germany, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and Nigeria. Now, if you bounce that against the top 10 populations, you'll find that 7 of the top 10 population centers are also in the top 10 for internet use. And according to the statistics here, about 44% of that is in Asia, about 23% is in Europe, and about 13% is in North America. So that's just kind of the lay of the land for internet users on that. Now, this looks at, I think, traditional desktop or laptop items on there. If you start looking at all the different, this adds up to about 2 billion devices on there. If you expand that to some of the smartphones and other mobile devices, we're almost talking one for every person on the planet that's out there now, and that's only going to continue. So again, trying to look at how all these interact certainly is not always going to be state on state. It's going to be transnational, and it's going to start to get to be a rather potentially dangerous area out there. In fact, this is just an interesting one talking about the way transnational threats can work in there. This is a map by the McAfee Corporation. It was in a report they did, and it just kind of looked at the top-level domain risks. So these are ones like, if you go to Russia, you know, blah, 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 .ru, .cn for China, you know, if you're looking at a .com, .org, something like that, but those domain names in there. Does anyone know, you see China is in red, we're kind of in brown. These are a cumulative risk, and again, you can read the report for all the details in there. But it's not just looking at malware is going to come in and co-op, but it's also looking at spam attacks and trying to look at stealing your personal identification information, et cetera. But what's this country in Africa? Anyone know? It's Cameroon. And the question's got to be, what the heck does Cameroon have to do with cyberspace, right? And this is one of those really neat things because it's incredibly simple. Their suffix is .cm. If you're going on your computer and you want to go to Amazon.com and you forget the O, what do you type in? Amazon.cm. And I've done that. And what comes up is this little thing saying, it tells you you're in Pennsylvania. It says, congratulations. Actually, a voice comes up and says, congratulations. You've been selected to receive one of our travel awards. Just complete this online survey, and we'll make sure and we'll facilitate getting your awards. And these other graphics come up, and they show like travel, legitimate sites in there. I just tried that one, and that was a little bit at risk. So there's other ones you can. I wouldn't really recommend it on there unless you have a virtual machine and acting as a sandbox. But what they've done is they said, hey, you know, this gets back to the cognitive portion. People make mistakes sometimes. They type in the wrong thing, and they're going into USA.com or PayPal.com or eBay.com or Amazon or Google or whatever. They hit the wrong one. Some of the organized crime, some of the transnational threats out there have said, this is an opportunity, and we're going to exploit it. Now, the item there is hopefully some of those other ones getting back to that State Department or that internet governance matrix. Hopefully, this is where other countries are going to get together and say, you know, we should try to maybe curtail some of this activity and shut that down. What I'd like to step through here in the last 5 minutes or so is a couple of examples from recent publications you may have read about, some things that have come up in the early bird and some other sources that give some examples of some of those transnational areas that might require action by the U.S. or support by the U.S. and could be in line with some of the strategies we're working. Probably two of the most familiar cases or the most written about were Estonia in 2007 and Georgia in 2008. Of course, Estonia had some cyber attacks that largely took place after they decided to move a monument to Russia in the Great Patriotic War, World War II, from a very prominent area to a less than prominent area, and they were attacked vigorously. Estonia, counterintuitively, if you didn't know before you read this, they're one of the most highly integrated electronic societies in the world. Just about everything they do, from licensing their dog up to paying their rent, et cetera, is done online. So it had a much more crippling effect than it might even the United States or other areas in there. They've also been very proactive in starting to look at how this would expand in as members of NATO now to areas such as NATO, Article 5 to say, well, we think we were attacked, or if this is considered attack, we would like all of NATO to come in and say it's attack on all of NATO on there, or at very least it's something that would kick off a NATO Article 4, which would be we consult about this and kind of look at the implications for potential military support and activity on that. This article here is in this month's or this latest issue of Joint Force Quarterly. So if you'd like some more background on there, I'd recommend that. The case with Georgia, there was an article in Parameters that was a couple, I think about 2 years ago that came out on that. One of the things I will point out, remember I mentioned the National Cyber Incident Response Plan that was done in draft last September within the United States. NATO is now working a very similar thing, the NATO computer incident response capability that they're trying to draw up to kind of have this, a certain kind of team that would be able to be available in NATO to do that. Now, some teams did come in from other areas, including the United States, to help both Estonia and Georgia sort out some of the efforts on that. In the case of Georgia, the cyber attacks largely started off as being defacement of websites and some other areas like that, but it coincided with Russian invasion in the country as well on that. And although these have never really been specifically and beyond a shadow of a doubt attributed to Russia, it certainly looks like all the earmarks that it was at least sponsored by them, if not outsourced to hackers or others on that. The case of Georgia also, and it's very well documented by Corns and Kastenberg in the article in Parameters, both which are lawyers, and they looked at some of the key international implications that came up with that, but certainly one of the ones in there dealt with third-party actions that were doing in cyberspace and the concept of neutrality in cyberspace. It just so happened that there was an American company in there. This TS Host was in Georgia when some of this started happening, and when they had some of their information in Georgia, the country, that they thought might be compromised, these guys said, well, hey, you know what, we can back that up at our facilities in Georgia, the U.S. state. Just coincidental. So they actually moved some items from Georgia in there. Did they get permission from the State Department? Did they get the permission from the U.S. government writ large? Did they coordinate it through the country team? No. But in the law, or in their review, they said the United States may have broken its neutrality in this. If this had come into a armed conflict, it could be potentially argued or interpreted that because we had a entity that was sanctioned by the United States that was doing some of the the data moving in there, it could be argued that it violated our neutrality. Again, it could be argued whether that would be the case or not. It's certainly something that is bringing up some areas that need to be looked into as we look into future conflict. Another issue that's been hot in the news is Stuxnet. And if you haven't read some of the early bird articles, there's been a lot of them. There's a good Vanity Fair article last year, and then this latest issue of Joint Force Quarterly had two articles in there about Stuxnet. One looking at saying was Stuxnet the equivalent of a special operations in cyberspace, and the other was questioning, kind of looking at, why did President Ahmadinejad not come out and explicitly say, hey, we were attacked? Again, the background on Stuxnet, or at least the point that's usually pushed to the forefront, is that Stuxnet is a computer worm that specifically goes and attacks programmable logic controllers in industrial processes. In this case, they were ones made by Siemens Corporation, and they were dealing with different things such as industrial processes, such as the control of high-speed centrifuges that are used to enrich uranium, which was the case in Iran. Symantec, again, kind of one of those bookends with McAfee as far as probably the two most popular antivirus companies in the United States, has a very good dossier on there. Again, online white paper, freely open to anyone on there. This was as of September 29th of last year. Kind of shows how many systems have been infected across how many countries. And when you see this chart and look at the numbers, it's far from a precision weapon in there. And these are some of the things that are being debated among maybe some of the more technically oriented individuals in there. But for the vast majority of the over 100,000 infected hosts are in Iran, but there's also ones in Indonesia, India, the U.S., Azerbaijan, and others in there. There's lots of reasons why the technical, I can discuss that offline, but the bottom line is when you start looking at some of the areas that need to be pondered in this, we're still not exactly sure. There's been a lot of debate thrown out, and again in these articles as well, about who did it, and I don't really care as much as what it is. It's sometimes working through the logic path of who could have done it and what their intentions would have been, and then what their legitimacy would have been, I think is more important to look at on this. Something that is clear, that is interesting to look at from the kind of technical point, though, is this has always been pushed forth that this is a leading edge, this is a new thing, it's this precision thing, and one of the articles in Joint Force Quarterly has kind of come out and said, it's probably not as innovative as we thought. It really looks like it's more of a combination of best practices. But regardless, it had to be well resourced because of some of the tricks that it used in there. And final thing, what does this actually come out to? Is this a use of force? Is this an act of war? Does it depend on who did it? And one of the questions I still like to ponder myself, and I'm glad that I think the second article here, why Iran didn't admit it was an attack, actually forwards the proposition which I've had for a while is, well, what if Iran did it on itself? The one on the special operations kind of notes that it was a tactical success but a strategic failure, because although it did have the effect, the overall, it did have a tactical effect of damaging some of the centrifuges, it didn't do enough damage to completely shut down the facility or really limit the production of uranium that much. Iran doing this, not going out and saying they were attacked. There's just a lot of different thought paths you can have into that, and it certainly leaves open. International law is built heavily upon precedents. So if it goes unchallenged, does this now mean if no one challenges something like that, is it now becoming internationally condoned by its lack of challenge? Just some things to think about as we're going through the process on there. And by the way, just to support what I said about that the idea that maybe this wasn't as innovative and as great as we thought, there's been several articles out on the Conficker worm, which is actually a botnet of over several million. That is, as far as the reports are, it's still out on afloat in the seas of cyberspace, if you would, with not exactly a known purpose or a known activity, but it kicked off in 2008, and it's had 5 variants really good. There's a book out now by Mark Bowden, who was author of Black Hawk Down, which for a layman steps through the entire process. And what's interesting, I've had a chance to read the book and talk with him on that. He takes it from a journalist view in there, so he tries to put it in layman's terms, but also looks at, describes the members of industry in academia. He calls them the cyber cabal that came together to kind of stop this worm from progressing. Very interesting in there. There was kind of an ad hoc solution. There wasn't as much government involvement in there. How things change with that is still open to debate. By the way, if you want to see they do have a Conficker working group website, and if you want to see if you're infected or not with Conficker, you can go there, and if you get all these symbols that come up, you're clean and green. If not, you may have different levels of infection in there. Thing about Conficker, it's designed so it will infect, and it tries specifically not to slow your computer down until it needs to use that computational capability. I guess one of the biggest questions still out there is, if this is still a stable botnet that's just sitting there waiting to be used, what could it possibly be used for? And if we were going to have a lesson on kind of the military applications, it kind of brings into a whole different light the concepts of mass and maneuver when you're talking about millions of computers that could be co-opted instantaneously. But that'll be for a theory chapter coming up soon. And finally, I just want to look at something I think we should even be more concerned about, getting back to the economic areas in here. And this is Wired Magazine last February came out with an article, Algorithms Take Control of Wall Street, and they talked about the fact that right now about 70% by volume of trading that goes on there is done by automation at the millisecond rate, by algorithms that are very good, designed by brilliant people that have sat there and know how the markets operate and all that. Problem is that when the first person came up with it, and as soon as the word got out that was how they got their competitive edge on the market, everyone started building their own algorithms. No one has really looked at how these algorithms work together and the theories of complexity theory, which it's a whole nother branch, and I know just enough to make myself dangerous in that, so I won't talk too much about it. But one of the things when you see a lot of complex processes working together like that, you get emergent behavior, which is usually unanticipated on there. And one could argue that on the 6th of May last year, that's exactly what happened. The emergent behavior was that in a 5-minute time period, the market dropped 573 points. Now, one of the automated breaks that had been put into place by other events in there stopped it. They reset some of the things on there. But you can just see here, this is a track of volume in the red, volume way up, and price going way down during that period in there. And you can read some of the items in there. This was pretty, you say, okay, it's an article by Wired magazine. Okay, are they kind of blowing it out of proportion? How are they doing it? Well, in September that year, the Federal Trade Commission and the Security and Exchange Commission came out with a formal report, and they went and did an investigation and kind of said, yeah, it said, the events that clearly demonstrate the importance of data in today's world of fully automated trading strategies and systems. And the interaction of automated execution systems and algorithmic trading strategies can quickly erode liquidity and result in disorderly markets. So you have to look at the very foundations of our economic security, or one of the foundations of that is we've kind of already handed the keys over to cyberspace on there. Personally, I'm not real comfortable with that, but I don't know how we extract ourselves out with that. And if you want to get to the transnational nature to that, the U.S. is not the only country doing that. And in fact, if you read the SEC report there, it talks about part of this drop in there was due to instabilities in other markets, Asia, Europe, and it was one of those perfect storms of all the things that were in there. But you could see things dropping and not be able to do anything about it because literally we're not in control. Okay. Well, let me sum up with just a few thoughts in there. I have two slides just to throw out some thoughts, and again, these are ones you can take to the future in there. If you're looking at doing future planning and strategy, dealing with cyberspace, or kind of refining the deck of cards that we have out there already, here's just a few things I think that need to be taken into consideration. First and foremost, the fundamental definition of sovereignty, the Westphalian state, it is being kind of looked at with cyberspace. This is definitely a transnational phenomenon. It's already in the, it's kind of globalized on steroids, a globalization on steroids. Dealing with internal interest in priorities of the United States. There we do have that juxtaposition of privacy and security that's taking place. And in fact, on the 8th of November, there was an example. There was a case argued before the Supreme Court, Jones versus the U.S., where they had some police officials in D.C. that put a GPS tracking device on a subject's car that eventually led to his arrest and conviction. They already had wiretapping privileges granted on that, and their argument was, well, this is a GPS tracking device. We're just following where he's going on in a publicly licensed vehicle on public roads, and that's now come before the Supreme Court. We'll see what comes out on that. This does still need to be pursued, I think, in a holistic manner across that full hand of cards, and we need to be looking for what those effects are and potential for emergent behavior. And then the question in the future, if we're looking at that what I talked about earlier about maybe having a separate effort that's just looking at how where cyberspace is going and what's going on with that, we need to look at how cyberspace is evolving. What are the roles? I didn't even touch on the aspect of the virtual world, and trust me, there is an economy in the virtual world. There is money laundering that's going on in virtual world. Has anyone heard of Bitcoin? There is a separate currency. You can actually trade Bitcoin, a virtual currency. There's an exchange rate between that and the dollar or whatever else. There's different ways and different items that are looking into that. Will cyberspace start eventually becoming self-organizing and self-regulating at some level when we start getting all these developments going on? And again, I'll foot stomp again the potential for a bifurcated approach to that. The three diagrams I put on here is just an interesting illustration. Getting back to the games and the poker. Not only does the United States play poker, we're probably better at playing checkers. Russia likes to play chess, and China likes to play Go. And those are, ironically, increasing levels of strategic sophistication as you go across that. So it's something we ought to take a look at, saying, well, maybe our adversaries are looking at cyberspace like a chess game or a Go game versus just checkers. Well, in summary, hopefully I've hit on ways of looking at what the national strategies are. They've gotten much better in the last year, but the overall integration of our strategies with regard to cyberspace are still largely ad hoc. One of the key needs is a prioritization of resources across there and risk assessment as we're going into cyberspace. And I would argue the need for a national vision for cyberspace and overall. One of the near-term goals that came out of the 2009 policy review from the White House originally said we were going to have a national cyberspace strategy. When the update came out this July, they kind of backed off and said we no longer see the need for that. These the international strategy, the NSTIC, the DoD strategy, all those suffice as a national strategy. I would argue that's not true because we don't know how those are all tied together. And Howard Schmidt alone, bless his heart, he's in a very tough position, is not going to be able to push that through. To support all of that, we need to have, I think, development of cyberspace theory, which is looking at the ontology. What is cyberspace? What is it becoming? And how is it going to interact with the other traditional commons that we have in there? And not to be an alarmist, but to kind of come full circle, the caution would be, unless we really strive to understand cyberspace through a deliberate